From the Historyogi Podcast, this is Dave. When we study and discuss history in Singapore, we usually focus on the social and political history of this country. However, the people's relationship with this island's natural environment also tells a rich story of its own. Today, we speak to Associate Professor Timothy Barnard from the National University of Singapore about his new edited book, Singaporean Creatures. We discuss environmental history during the colonial era from his previous book and how early national development policies regulated and restructured Singapore's relationship with animals. So, thanks very much, Prof. Barnard, for joining us today. To start off, in 2019, you released a book titled Imperial Creatures, which looked at the history of animals in colonial Singapore up till 1942. Could you help us understand how colonialism tamed the island's fauna and what were some of its long term effects?
Well, the key factor, Imperial Creatures, when I'm looking at the history of animals, it's really looking at the history of Singapore through the experiences of animals and human animal relations. And in this regard, while we have a long-standing history in Singapore that stretches long before 1819, 1819 is an important date because it is essentially when British imperialism arrives, new ways of looking at the island, new ways of looking at the landscapes and the animals and the peoples that are here. And not only that, you have certain tools. And by tools, I mean imperialism, capitalism, globalization, things like this, that help transform the landscape. And I think the best example of that is the idea that in Singapore, you had an island that was essentially covered in tropical rainforest. There were mangroves and such. There was a very small population in 1819, about 1,000 people, it's estimated. With the arrival of the British, within several decades, 4 or 5 decades, there was a complete deforestation of the island. They spread out and cut down the primary forest. And by they, I mean, it was Chinese agriculturalists under a system developed or allowed by the British to make the land useful, to grow crops and such. Now, that's plants. They cut down the trees, but that also has an influence on animals because what you're taking is a very diverse ecosystem of different trees and different grasses and other plants and simplifying the space. You're literally reducing it to a handful of plants such as gambier or pepper or nutmeg. And what that does is it means that animals that depend on that diversity have difficulty surviving. So certain birds, certain insects and such have difficulty surviving in this new transforming landscape. And so with the arrival of the British, not only did our economy change, the population, a lot of things, we also have to realize our environment changed, our ecosystems changed. And this can be told through animals. So you had animals that lived in primary forests, and they no longer were, to put it politely, welcome. And whether they were purposefully made to go away, or they just died because the plants and the ecosystems they needed to survive disappeared. The best example of that would be tigers. Tigers arrive as the forest. Tigers do not like to live in primary forest. They like to live in disturbed forest. And so once plantations were being constructed or cultivated, what you had was that is disturbed forest. So tigers came over from Johor or from the Malay Peninsula and began to live in our forests where they would eat pigs or deer and also humans. Now, as we deforested the whole island, there was no longer an ecosystem for the tigers to live in, so we no longer have tigers. Some of that was through hunting, but some of it was also through environmental change and the changing landscape.
So, what motivated you to help compile a new book on Singaporean creatures, and how does it continue on from Imperial Creatures?
Imperial Creatures ended in 1942. I decided to have the book focus on colonialism and the effects of colonialism. And it just was it felt right for the parameters of the book. So the idea with the new edited book, Singaporean Creatures, is basically to take the tale from 1942 to present. So to look at human animal relations, but since or during World War II, but also since then. And that's a time of massive change in Singapore. And not just political, but not only do we have the Japanese come, the British come back, Singapore joins Malaysia, we have Singapore becoming an independent nation, and then we have the modernization of Singapore, which has a lot of implications for the environment. But we also have changing relations between animals and humans. And so the main idea in the book, and when I first approached the authors that appear in the book, I said, just pick an animal or a topic about animals that takes place after World War II or during World War II, and just tell us about it. Tell us how it shifted or reflected various changes in Singaporean society, or how just humans came to live here and how they became comfortable with certain things. So what we have in the end in the book are 8 chapters that focus on different animals, different aspects of Singaporean history, but basically focus primarily on one animal. There's a few that talk about other things, but basically focus on one animal or one type of animal and how that animal can tell us more about Singaporean history, about human history here.
In studying the history of animals in Singapore, what kinds of sources did you discover and find most useful? And were there any unusual repositories where you found surprising information?
Okay, that for both books that I've worked on with animals in Singapore, it is one of the appeals to me is that it has such unusual sources. In other words, one of the things that initially drew me to Southeast Asian history, where I have worked previously on Indonesia and Malaysian history and now in Singaporean history, is I don't like to I'll use the phrase traditional archives. I don't go down to, I do use the National Archives, but if you go to the National Archives and say, for example, I want a file on monkeys, you'll be there for a very brief amount of time. There's just not a lot. Or I want a file on mosquitoes, 2 of the chapters I wrote in the new book. There's just not a lot. So what that really means is you have to construct a story using a very disparate, wide-ranging source base. And so, for example, one of the tremendous helps has been so far Newspapers SG, which is a database that essentially has digitized Singaporean newspapers, almost all Singaporean newspapers that are available, and more importantly, provided a search engine for them so that you can go in and type in a word such as monkeys or macaque or apes and various things. And you get various hits, and then you can read the articles and get the information and then cobble it together like a puzzle where you see certain trends and you see certain things happening. In each instance, I've also discovered in the stories I've written about animals is there's often, the reason I write about a particular animal is there's often an event or something big that happens that really reflects another aspect of society. So, for example, in the Imperial Creatures book, there's an entire chapter basically on the outbreak of rabies. Rabies was brought here by pet dogs in the 1880s, and there was a massive outbreak. Now, these were elite dogs owned by the elite of society, pet dogs imported from England, not strays on the street. But initially, of course, they blamed strays on the street. And there were a series of restrictions put on dogs. There was certain attempts to get rid of dogs. But a lot of it was all about registration, of organizing the dog population, of making them wear collars, making them wear identity tags. And so that reflects larger changes in the government and also how they treat the human population, frankly. In the current book, there is a chapter on monkeys. And the key event that it basically revolves around was in 1971, the government they successfully rid the Botanic Gardens of monkeys. Monkeys were one of the most common attractions in the Botanic Gardens for much of its history. But in the early 1970s, there was a belief that we need to start distinguishing between wild and civilized, between developed and what we let be, if you will. And the space of the Botanic Gardens was seen as something that needed to be regulated, to organize. It was a park, civilized. So therefore, monkeys needed to be gotten rid of. And eventually the government tried different measures, from poisoning to shooting them and other things. But what happened at the end of the day was the surviving monkeys all went to the central catchment area. And the central catchment area became an area of wildness, of where nature is allowed to exist. Of course, as time goes by, we then begin to get closer to the central catchment area. Condos are built, the BKE cuts through it. We as humans go on walks and to enjoy nature and things. And the main point is we start bumping into monkeys, and monkeys start coming into the condos, and the conflict develops. And so that chapter, for example, using the Botanic Gardens and what happened in 1971 as an example, is about how a modernizing society begins to regulate spaces and to develop distances between where humans can live and animals can live, when Singapore becomes a garden city. And what does that mean to have a curated space of greenery, a curated space of animals and humans? And what do we do with the wild? Are we comfortable with the wild in Singapore? And that's a difficult question in urban spaces. So beginning in the 1970s, the government began regulating what animals you could keep in your home. So the most famous of those, of course, is no cats in HDB. But this also extended to all other animals. Only domesticated animals could be placed in HDB. And of course, there's sub rules and within that. But one of these was, since a monkey cannot be domesticated, no more monkeys in households. Monkeys were very popular pets in Singapore up through the 1950s and 60s. So it changed the animals in our households, our relationship with them and such. But you find all this through a variety of sources. You can't just really go to the archives and say, give me a file on monkeys. There is no file on monkeys. There's no file on mosquitoes. There's no file on a variety of these things. But what you do is you find different sources from the science faculty, from newspapers SG, from the Nature Society, from accounts of people that lived at the time. There were oral history recordings describing what happened to the monkeys in 1971. And you essentially bring all of these together, and then you start to see a picture, and you start to see trends and things that you want to write about in the book or in the chapter you may be assigned.
In this book, you've contributed a chapter on mosquitoes. Why were mosquitoes such a threat, and why did Singapore prioritize controlling mosquitoes even with other pressing national needs?
Yes. Well, yeah, mosquitoes, based on their size, is not a problem or an issue. But is interesting to me about the story of the mosquito is they were always, you can find 19th century complaints about them buzzing you, or there's mosquitoes in Singapore and such. But they were just seen as a bother, a nuisance. They only became an enemy. They only became a problem once science developed and medicine developed, and there was a realization that mosquitoes are vectors for certain diseases, and particularly in our case, malaria and dengue fever. And so what happened beginning in the 19-teens, the 1920s, was there was a serious effort on behalf of the government to provide anti-mosquito measures. That might mean draining of ponds, It could be checking people for malaria, providing quinine to help counter the symptoms of malaria. And this was because malaria was seen as something that threatened economic development. It was something that it was more difficult to work on rubber plantations, for example, or it was more difficult to work outside. And in the 19 teens, malaria was the second biggest killer in Singapore. So it was a matter of public health and having a healthy working population and getting rid of malaria. So beginning in the 1920s, the government, and it also became an example of a positive colonial government program. In other words, the British could say, see, we're helping everybody here. We're providing a good atmosphere and environment. So what they began to do was in the 19 teens and 20s is develop measures to counter malaria. Now, this is where one of the interesting things I learned about my studies with mosquitoes is, of course, there's two different types of mosquitoes that one causes malaria, one carries dengue fever. The Anopheles mosquito carries malaria. What's interesting about that is malaria mosquitoes live in open bodies of water, if you will, like ponds or various things that are outdoors in a field or a drain, for example. And those are under the control of the government. And so therefore, in the 20s and 30s, the government had programs to try to drain ponds or swampy areas. They would create better drains so you would not have standing water. But these were mostly on lands the government controlled. And so, okay, sure, fine. And that worked well. Now, malaria, they were so successful in fighting malaria that by the 1950s, essentially malaria was wiped out in Singapore. No one worries about malaria today in Singapore. And that came to be true in the 1950s, the early 1960s. And it's great. It is a true success story of public health, of creating drains, of draining water and providing education to people. And it was a wonderful story. However, there tends to be a switch, and it happens around 1965. And that is because we now have a new threat with mosquitoes, and that's dengue fever. Many people have had dengue fever in Singapore, and I have, knock on wood, I haven't had it yet, but I have many friends that have had it. And the thing is, dengue fever is spread by a different mosquito. It's spread by the Aedes mosquito. And what's interesting about the Aedes mosquito is it's called a domesticated mosquito. In other words, it likes to live in urban built up spaces. It can live in a tin can, can live in a pot in your house. And therefore, think of it this way, mosquitoes started to enter the house, or at least dangerous mosquitoes began to enter the house. And this happens at a time when we're building a more urban environment. We're starting to build HDB flats. People are moving into these flats. It is a perfect environment for the Aedes mosquito. And so dengue fever starts to take off in the late 60s, early 1970s, and it becomes a problem. And so, but the government uses the same strategies they use for malaria. We'll drain, we'll come in, education. We all know the posters and various things have been taught over time. And eventually what happens is, because it is a domesticated mosquito, because it's in an urban space inside households, that gives an increased impetus for the government to not just take care of its own lands, but to go into households. And many people have had the NEA guy come by and check, do you have any standing water in your house and things like this. And this comes from that, to try to make sure there's no Aedes mosquitoes in your house spreading dengue. And so the thing is, it shifted how the government also deals with the society. Previously, if it was on public lands, okay, fine, good, take care of it. Now the government comes into your house. It's about disciplining the household. It's about getting people to take responsibility for standing water in their house and such. And that's a fundamental shift in how the government's relationship with the people and public health and development and modernization of the society. And so when you learn about these different mosquitoes, but more importantly, where they live, but also the various attempts we have had to deal with them, whether it's malaria or dengue. It's interesting the methods the government has employed, but also the implication of those different methods. And so that's the view I take on the mosquito chapter, is to think about government's relationship with the human population and how they use mosquitoes to not only as a program to promote public health and modernization, but how that can also have certain, I'll say, blowback, because creating the urban environment we live in today is perfect for dengue mosquitoes. And so we now have a problem of dealing with that. And it's a problem that still persists. We're still trying new methods, for example, with the Project Wolbachia, where we're trying to release infertile mosquitoes in the population, and then that hopefully will reduce the number of Aedes mosquitoes. And it seems to be successful at this point. They're still working on it, still releasing those mosquitoes. But it waits to be seen the ultimate end of that story. It's still ongoing.
Now, there is a chapter by Faiza Zakaria on the evolving history of songbirds.
Yes.
She draws a link between the songbird trade in newly independent Singapore with political patronage exercised via urban redevelopment. So could you share why songbirds were useful in this way, and what new issues did the promotion of songbirds create for the urban environment and wildlife conservation?
Well, I'm speaking for Faiza, but she wrote an excellent chapter on this. But essentially, when we had the development of HDB and public housing in Singapore beginning I know it began earlier, but particularly in the 1960s and 1970s, and when people seriously began moving into HDB flats. I mentioned earlier that the government was then beginning to regulate what animals you could keep in your house, what was a pet, cats being the most famous example, but also monkeys and other animals. Well, within that development, this is when songbirds start to become very popular. Songbirds they had existed in Singapore, of course, for over a century, and they were a common pet and such. But beginning in the 1960s, the government began promoting songbirds as the ultimate kind of HDB pet, because you can keep it in a cage. It's under control within your HDB flat. And therefore, it was a nice animal to have around the house, and pleasant songs and such. Plus, it created a certain community feel. You could go down in your neighborhood, and that Tiangbaro was famous for that for a long time. And there's several other neighborhoods in Singapore that still exist where you can go and see the songbirds on display. And it was a way for the community to interact. And so the government became involved in promoting the songbird contests, but also, in a sense, just keeping birds in your house. And they would do this through handing out prizes, organizing competitions, and such. Now, that's an interesting story. But within that, when you move outside of HDB, because sometimes these birds get released and sometimes they join the wild here, it also began to influence the type of birds people wanted to have, and birds labeled as, well, I would say welcomed birds or not welcome, because most of these songbirds are non-native birds. A good example is the Javan myna. The Javan myna, which bothers us at hawker centers and various other places, was originally imported to Singapore as a songbird. And it was finally one or two were released somewhere in the Chua Chu Kang area in the 1930s, I believe, and then eventually spread all over Singapore until today, when we have them in all of our hawker centers, basically. Now, the same thing is happening also with other songbirds. Now, what's interesting with all the deforestation in Singapore, some songbirds do well in forests, some songbirds do not. So with the limited amount of forest in Singapore, that influences the type of birds that we have and where you can find them. So, for example, the birds that might be in the central catchment area, where there's larger stands of trees, will be different than the species that can be found in your average neighborhood, like Ang Mo Kio or wherever it might be, or Jurong or something. And so the thing is that influences the type of birds, but also then within the birding community, it then becomes what is natural for the landscape, because a lot of these non-native birds have made themselves at home here. And so it has influenced our biodiversity in the sense of what are the animals in our forest, what are the animals we hear chirping outside our window when we wake up. And so in her chapter, Faiza traces that how songbirds were perfect pets, if you will. It was promoted by the government. But then it also influenced the type of birds that would eventually populate our forests or our non-forested areas based on the type of ecosystem a specific bird likes to live in.
Now, one can't talk about animals in Singapore without discussing the wildlife parks we have. A chapter by Chu Ritze documents the Singapore Zoo's rise as a national project. What was the zoo's role in selling the Singapore story to both citizens and the global public?
Well, one thing I find very interesting in Ritze's story that he tells, he essentially documents the history of the Singapore Zoo. And what's interesting to me was that it was a planned zoo, if you will. And it was under the direction of the Public Utilities Board and the Tourism Board. It was seen as a modern city needs a zoo. And so therefore, they created a zoo to attract tourists. The idea was you need something for tourists to do when they're in Singapore. This will give them something to do for another day. And so they developed the zoo in Mandai in the early mid 1970s. And then what Racy does is he takes the story of the zoo and talks about it through particular animals, but also particular phases of modern Singaporean history. So, for example, when the zoo was opened, it was planned by PUB, which I found very surprising. It was a tourism site. But what you had was, he tells the story of a panther that lived there that escaped. It had actually escaped before the zoo officially opened. And this panther, Black Panther, lived in the central catchment area for 2 or 3 years before it was discovered, before they found it again. And frankly, they killed it. But during that period, it became a bit of a celebrity because you had a panther roaming around in the central catchment area. But it reflected this animal that doesn't belong in Singapore, if you will, that escaped in a zoo that was slowly developing. He then tells the story of basically the orangutans, or of course Amang, and how that reflected tourism and globalization, attracting international tourists to come and have it. Many people remember breakfast with Amang or breakfast with the orangutan. And he tells that story of kind of Singapore entering global markets and modernizing and attracting international tourists through the story of Amang. And then he finishes the story with an account of Anuka, the first, or as far as I know, only polar bear born in the tropics. And so how Anuka went through, there was a lot of questioning about the presence of a polar. What is a polar bear doing in the tropics? At times, the polar bear seemed a bit bored within its confines. At one point, it turned green due to algae in the water. And this led to a lot of questioning from the public and concern. But then eventually, when Anuka passed away after a normal length of life, he was embraced. In other words, the prime minister spoke well of Anuka, and people went to ceremonies and wakes and memorials for Anuka. And it was how this foreign animal that in many respects didn't belong in Singapore had been adopted and by Singapore and embraced. And so he follows the modernization and the globalization of Singapore through these animals and through a study of how the zoo was developed and how it fits within government policies.
Finally, given how drastically Singapore's landscape has changed since independence, what can Singaporeans learn from histories of flora and fauna beyond snapshots of the past?
What they can learn is we live in a city that is quite green. It is, for an urban space, we live in a very green, biodiverse city, state, island. But what I hope people get from reading a lot of this is how much it has changed, how much it has developed. I mean, when we talk about things within the traditional Singapore story, third world to first, or development and things like that, it's hard for people to understand that this was once a jungle covered island. It went through phases. It was not always, and we shouldn't over romanticize it. It was 150 years ago, it was cut down. It was completely deforested. There were attempts by the colonial government to reforest, which today is essentially why we have the central catchment area. We have also gone from a population of 1,000 to 6 million. That's remarkable. And so that change from different times, different governments, different peoples being here, really, if you examine the environment, you can just gain greater insight into society. Because how society interacts with the environment, how society gets to think about what its place is, its relationship to plants and animals, can tell you a lot. And so when you tell someone that, look, Singapore had 75,000 people in 1870, we didn't have enough water. So we had to build McRitchie, for example. We had to build the central catchment area around McRitchie to protect that water. There were implications to all the deforestation and the biodiversity drop. Actually, our biodiversity is coming back. I mean, we love, let's be honest, the government and in-parks and the environment ministry love to talk about how it's what a city in nature is the phrase now, a garden city in nature. It is a very biodiverse city, but there has been a rebound in a lot of this. And that's an important story in our modern world where we're very concerned with climate change, and change does occur. There's no denying that. But sometimes we can come up with solutions to deal with problems. We can react and fix things. And so I hope that when people look at the environment, it gives them a view outside of, I'll use the phrase, the traditional economics or politics of history, to consider the society, consider the landscape, consider how it's developed and changed and shifted over time. And hopefully, if you do that, you in many respects, come up with a better appreciation of Singapore. And I hope you arrive at a greater appreciation of its history and all the various people, but also plants and animals that have influenced it.